Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm thrilled to welcome Maggi Hambling as well as Nicolette Jones to the Charleston Festival. I can see by your rapturous report and your applause that Maggi needs very little introduction. She's simultaneously one of our most celebrated and one of our most controversial artists. And I'm sure she wouldn't cherish one of those. I'm sure she would rather have both those labels than just one of them. Her most recent exhibition, Walls of Water at the National Gallery, was a series of seascapes. She's always been drawn to the power and mystery of the oceans. Her current book, War, Requiem and Aftermath, has a particular poignancy as we're marking the centenary of the First World War, as well as significant World War II anniversaries, not to mention subsequent and current international conflicts. Nicolette Jones, the daughter of an artist and also a critic and a reviewer, will see whether she can discover what makes the renowned artist Maggi Hambling, devotee of cigarettes and whiskey, as I think you can see, what makes her tick. So I'm going to hand over to Nicolette. And once more, welcome Nicolette and Maggi.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Diana. It is a joy to be back at Charleston and a privilege to have a chance to talk to Maggi Hambling about her work, her life, and her latest installation, War, Requiem. Maggi was born in Suffolk, studied in East Anglia and at Ipswich, and then at the Slade. And in 1980, she was the National Gallery's first ever artist in residence. She won the Jerwood Painting Prize in 1995. She received an OBE and then subsequently a CBE. War Requiem was recently on show at King's College London.
Still is.
And still is. Oh.
End of the month.
I thought it closed. Good. I thought it closed on the 9th of May. I'm glad to know. And it was formerly at the Dovecote at Snape Maltings, where it was exhibited as part of a centenary tribute to Benjamin Britten. It isn't, of course, Maggi's first tribute to Britten. Her famous Scallop was erected in Aldeburgh in 2003 with words from Peter Grimes pierced around its edge. I hear those voices that will not be drowned. Sound, not least Britten's sound, is evidently important to you, Maggi. And War Requiem includes a sound installation, as well as being accompanied by a loop of the Dies Irae from the original War Requiem. Tell us about the importance of sound in your life, and particularly the importance of Britten. Are you a keen musician? Do you listen to music while you work?
Well, the soundtrack of Coronation Street is quite a favourite. It was 2013 was Britain's centenary, yes. And the artists involved in SNAP, that's Art at the Aldeburgh Festival at Snape Maltings in Suffolk, were asked to respond to the work to Benjamin Britten in some way or other. And I knew it had to be the War Requiem because I will never forget my first encounter with it on a record in the 60s, yes. Soon after it had had its premiere at Coventry Cathedral. Mm. And it was such a very strange, grand, moving, mysterious piece of music. It really sort of, the hairs stood up on my back when I heard it. And so I knew I wanted to make some response to that piece of music. And so that's how the installation, which now belongs to Aldeburgh Music, and it's been on through April. So you missed that. Don't have to go to Suffolk, far too far. You missed that. But the King's College show, which is War Requiem and Aftermath, is on until the end of the month. And I've made War Requiem 2 for that exhibition. And so it is enter the installation. Ideally when it's during the moments of silence and
There's 8 minutes, isn't there, of the War Requiem with 2 minutes of pause in between.
That's what I'm talking about, the silence, yes. And then that incredible piece of music starts, and it's the installation is about the combination of my paintings of war victims and battlefields with that piece of music, and 2 mirrors are set amongst the paintings, so visitors catch a glimpse of themselves reflected among the war victims, and I mean it sort of helps to make the person feel very present in that space, and also one person at a time. So if this lot went to King's College next week, there'd be a very long queue to get into it. But I mean the reason for the one person at a time is largely inspired by a room in Liebeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin, which at the end of one of the some of you may have been there, at the end of one of the very wonky corridors, you enter alone into this room through a very thick steel door, which is promptly shut behind you, and it's completely bare concrete walls, and it's quite dark. And you stand in this space with a tiny, very tall space, a tiny window set against the ceiling, very high up on the right with bars on it that you could never possibly look out of. And on the left, a little sort of 6-foot ladder set high on the wall going into the ceiling. So there's this feeling of chill and no escape. And it brings everything right into the present. And it was one of the most chilling places I've ever been in. And that's where the idea of one person at a time comes from, because if the installation is sort of filled with a family with sort of 6 children, it just won't work.
But that room for the sound installation, you have on tape part of your 2009 poem, don't you?
That's a different installation. That's You Are the Sea.
You Are the Sea, yes.
Yeah.
And that's not, but that's not part of Aftermath. I have to confess the queue was too long when I saw the exhibition.
Amateur.
Because most of these people I tried to go back. It was still too long. But
very bad.
Yes. I'm sorry.
What's your name again? No, there are 2 installations in the show. One is War Requiem, and one is You Are the Sea, which evolved from a 2009, I think, poem I wrote as a sort of love poem to the sea and remembrance, and that's quite different.
Which brings me to the Walls of Water, which I'd quite like to talk about a little bit before we get on to the War Requiem, your most recent exhibition at the National Gallery. 9 large canvases of...
8.
I miscounted. A series of large canvases with breaking waves upon them. You set yourself the incredibly difficult task of capturing the moment when a wave breaks. Just tell us about the moment that inspired those, standing by the seashore.
Well, I've been involved with painting the North Sea since November the 30th, 2002. I'd made the maquette, the model for Scallop. That's the thing on Aldeburgh Beach that not everybody's in love with. And I'd driven early that morning to Thorpeness, and there was a huge storm raging. I mean, in the sky, the shingle was being thrown. It was terrifically exciting, big waves. And I went back to my studio, and I was painting a little portrait from memory of a London beggar. And being rather slow, coming from Suffolk, we're very slow in Suffolk, it wasn't until 3 o'clock in the afternoon I asked myself, what the hell am I doing, painting from memory this London beggar, when what is inside me was that storm of the morning, and it was still raging through the trees outside my studio. And so that was the first little sea painting on November the 30th, 2002, and then Scallop got to be made and the rest of it. But the North Sea got me really then by the short and curlies, and it goes on. But I mean, the Walls of Water at the National Gallery were inspired by the biggest waves I've ever seen, encountered off the Suffolk coast. I mean, 10, 12, 15 feet high, crashing and really challenging the sea wall, as if it's about to smash it up, in the very otherwise polite and genteel resort of Southwold. This whole bit of nature was really having its say against the the politeness of Southwold. And it was very, 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 very exciting. They were frightening, they were beautiful, but it was exciting, and that's what gave rise to the series of Walls of Water, which began towards the end of 2010. And the smaller canvas, the smaller one, there were 8 big ones, and then the smaller one was for Amy Winehouse.
Amy Winehouse, indeed. We'll come to that again in a moment, but I do think when you stand there in front of those canvases, it is being polite in the National Gallery. It was an exhilarating experience because you did feel as if the water was about to break over you, which was presumably the effect you intended. Amy Winehouse, of course, one of the things you said about that 9th picture was that you hoped that it would express the sound of her music and the sound of her voice. So sound was very much in that particular image as well. Do you have a soundtrack in your head when you paint?
Well, I did listen to the War Requiem a lot while I was making the victims and battlefields. Mm-hmm. And when Amy Winehouse died, of course, it was a huge tragedy because, that raw, naked passion of her voice, which, of course, goes on, thank the Lord, it was a very upsetting thing. And when she died, I did attempt a large portrait head of her on a canvas 4 feet tall by 3 feet wide. And it was, it went on and it went on. Mm-hmm. Disaster. Stanley knife time, which is not a happy experience after 2 or 3 months, So then on the same new canvas, same size, I tried a painting of Amy very, very tiny, which she was, singing in a great big space of the rest of the canvas. Another disaster.
Yes.
So when I got rid of those 2 paintings, I went into the studio the next morning and took out another 4 by 3, but this time horizontally, and I painted a wall of water for Amy Winehouse, and it's a darn sight better than those first 2. But so when I'm asked how long did it take to paint that picture, it's an impossible question to answer, because quite often I can work on something for a number of months, and a painting lives and dies many times in the course of its making. But if it really does kick the bucket, you've got to get rid of it. But quite often, after, say, 2 or 3 months on one go at the thing, you get rid of it, and the painting can actually happen in an hour and a half or something. And then that's the best feeling in the world.
Should we have a look at some of the paintings that you produced for that exhibition, for War Requiem and Aftermath? Can we have one, John? Yes, thank you. Now, the theme, of course, the overriding theme of the exhibition is conflict, and this was an early inspiration, was it not? One of the starting points.
It's the earliest piece of work in the exhibition. I did it when I was at the National Gallery, and it's a study of the soldier that's standing rather apart from the rest of the firing squad in Manet's execution of the Emperor Maximilian. And I was drawn to make this study because of the expression on the soldier's face. He's preparing his gun. It's a sort of this mixture of resignation and I think sort of maybe a bit of doubt, but he's just got, that is his job, it's what he's got to do, he's got to shoot someone. But I found that particular soldier very moving, and that's what made me make that study in charcoal from the painting.
And then you had a painting that predated the Gulf War. Is that
By
right?
4 years, yes.
By 4 years. And seems very resonant to us now. Tell us a bit about how that one came about.
Well, it was the source of this painting was a black and white. You're seeing everything the same size, obviously, on this screen. It's about 5 feet wide by 4.5 something tall. And it was a black and white image in the newspaper. When did I paint this painting?
In 86.
Oh, yes. Got to keep, make it right. 86 to 87, that's right. There was suddenly in a newspaper this very shocking, obviously, well, at that time, black and white photograph of these women in the desert, and you just didn't see people in those clothes anywhere at that time. Everywhere now, but then you didn't see it. And so to me it was very, very shocking that there were these women in seemingly biblical costume practicing with this very heavy rocket launcher.
You also said the pink was significant.
Yes, so I knew the desert was pink because the painter Robert Medley, who was head of painting when I was a student at Camberwell there in the 60s, had spent the war painting tanks pink so that they wouldn't be seen in the desert, you see, so I knew that it was pink. But I did play around also with the colours of women's makeup, foundation and all that stuff, you know, to sort of make some kind of, I don't know, some sort of Western point compared with what was going on. I was just deeply shocked, and it belongs to New Hall in Cambridge, and it hangs in their dining room. And a few years ago, the high military Americans were having a dinner there, and so they covered this painting up, which I thought I was very cross.
Yes.
And there was a bit of a student thing about it, but anyway, they thought it might not appeal to obviously the high-up American military people were paying a lot of money to have dinner there, so
yes, but
they didn't want to offend them.
They're precisely the people that ought to be looking at it, surely.
Yeah.
Yes. Shall we move on? Next. Oh, yes. Cuddling skulls.
May not all be bad, you know. Maybe a few jokes. And there's no one here to tell us otherwise. No, this came after a trip to Mexico, where I think the attitude to death in Mexico is far more healthy than it is here. You know, many of you must have seen in street parades, festivals, not just the Day of the Dead festival, but in parades and street carnivals. I mean, you know, people go around with skeletons on their shoulders, and they carry skulls, and there is death, absolutely, the other half of life, right there with you while you're alive, and I think that's a lot healthier. And I painted this happy picture of these two cuddling skulls after that trip to Mexico.
And in a way, it's a theme of all of your work, the proximity of life and death, that even the battlefields of war requiem are full of energy and life in the execution of them.
Yes. George Melly always said I would go down in art history as Maggi Hambling because of my way of drawing people in their coffins, drawing people just before death, after death, and going on painting them after they've died. I mean, if you love someone, they go on being alive inside you, and I think this is where artists are very lucky that they can have this positive way of grieving. I mean, I went on painting George Melly for 2 years after he died, and obviously it's sort of ironic that you're trying to make a portrait with as much life as possible of someone who's actually dead, and it wasn't until the lorry came to take the paintings to the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. The next morning I went up to the studio and said the studio was bare and it had been full of George for 2 years. Yes. And I said to myself, well, Maggie, you better face it, George is dead. You know, but you're very lucky to be able to, as I say, grieve in a positive way.
And is there an issue reconciling the idea of making things of beauty out of fear, horror, death?
I don't think much about beauty, except in people.
So you could also argue that these objects are things of beauty. Of course they're things of beauty.
Well, I didn't set out to make beautiful paintings.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Don't do roses or anything like that.
No. I was thinking of beauty in a wider sense.
Oh, I see. Spiritual, yes.
Yes, right then.
Next, John. John, next, please.
Speaking of coffins.
Yeah, coffins, good.
Yes, this little coffin here on the right. Tell us about that.
Well, it's a sculpture which is owned by the Tate, and you see the thing looking rather. Oh yes, they've got another screen, haven't they? Clever. You see this little thing looking rather like a Giacometti head on the left. It's about this big, And it's a piece of melted car engine, because I discovered in a country lane this abandoned car that had obviously been set fire to, and inside it were these wonderful shapes of aluminium. So that's a bit of melted car engine, which I had cast in bronze quite a lot, and then I could play with it, adapt it, do all sorts of things with it. And so the idea is that this strange vessel, which actually rocks, is going somewhere. The flag, as you can see, is bent over at the top, and that head has been inverted, so the heads within the coffin are hanging upside down, and as it's bronze, when they clang together, it makes this rather wonderful sort of Chinese music.
A beautiful thing out of...
Well, the sound's quite nice, and I didn't know the sound was going to happen. That was a bit of a gift.
But it does suggest hanging bodies, it does suggest lynchings a bit to me.
That's okay. I don't issue instructions.
Yes.
I mean, people can feel whatever they want to feel. That's very important. I mean, people saw in those waves, people saw faces and animals and all sorts of things, which I wasn't aware of putting there when I made the work, but they just happen. And people can see what they want.
When you were artist in residence at the National Gallery, you, on Wednesday afternoons, used to tour the gallery and talk to people about the paintings. And I remember you took people around and showed them the De La Roche execution of Lady Jane Grey and said, this is the worst painting that ever existed. And
well, the worst in the National Gallery,
worst in
yes.
the National Gallery. And
then I found out it was the most popular painting in the
Indeed. So what I'm really asking is, do you value the response of individual people if they are people who think that De La Roche is the best painting in the National Gallery?
Well, I mean, nobody... When I was a student at Camberwell, I once asked Robert Medley, I said, what is the difference between art and craft? He thought for a minute, and he said, well, dearie, craft is useful. So I'm doing something that's completely useless, and I don't think about people's reaction. You can't paint a picture or make anything at all if you sort of think about how people are going to react to it. You know, you work alone in a studio, it goes out into the world, and then it has a life of its own. There's not much I can do about it.
So the audience is not the point?
No.
And
well, they are tonight. Look at them. Full house.
And what about critics? Do you care about the critical response to things?
I agree with Oscar Wilde when he said, when the critics disagree, the artist is at one with himself. And also the great Donald Woolfit, who some of you look old enough to remember. When he got a good review, he said, written by, what an intelligent person. And when he got a bad review, he said, written by one of my enemies. So that covers it all. I mean, all that matters is column inches, really. I mean, I've had, terrible reviews, and a week later I meet someone and say, wonderful piece in the paper. I mean, what are they reading? I don't know. I mean, the only thing that, I agree with whoever, Cecil B. DeMille or something, column inches, that's all that matters. Because I don't think people really read things. Well, of course, they read books, because we're here for books, but what's written in tomorrow's fish and chip paper, I don't think people often remember very much.
Yes, good. So it doesn't matter to you either way. That's nice to know. Shall we look at the next?
Yeah.
This is part of the series, isn't it? Are these the victims, or is it an earlier one?
It's an earlier painting, and it's just called Portrait. And it was inspired by that extraordinary term, which I haven't heard for a long while, but at that time it was bandied about, friendly fire, which I thought was quite extraordinary. How could there be friendly fire that was going on and killing people? So that painting's from the imagination. It's just called Portrait, and friendly fire.
Next, shall we do?
Next, John. Oh, he's there. Look, good.
Yes, and this is Sebastian. Tell us about him.
Sebastian Halsley, he was a great friend of mine. He wrote a marvellous book called Dandy in the Underworld. It's quite strong stuff. He was a dandy, he was a marvellous writer, he was a wit, he was an artist, he was a great friend of mine. He was also, unfortunately, took a lot of drugs. And he had posed for me for drawings and paintings while he was alive, and then he died at the age of 47 from an overdose of drugs in 2010, and I've made about a dozen portraits of him since he died. Yeah.
And he wore a red sequin suit the first time you met him, is that right?
Could have done, but he was rather keen on the velvets of extraordinary colours and terrible hats. Stovepipe hats, do you know what they are? God, they were a mistake. I was always telling him, but he didn't take any notice. But I mean, he was an extraordinary creature, you know, he's a one-off, there'll never be another Sebastian. And he was very funny.
Some of the people who've inspired you, Max Wall, Marilyn Monroe, George Melly, what is it about these subjects? Is it that you like the unusual? Are they particular? Were there particular reasons for choosing those people?
Well, I suppose I was... my art teacher at school, before I got to art school, said, a subject chooses you. You don't choose a subject. That's very, very important. Mm-hmm. The subject must be in charge of what I do. And I don't know, I mean, George was a great friend. I loved him. And I was very, very fond of Sebastian. And
the celebrities, the Max Walls and the...
Well, I found Max Wall Max Wall was playing his one-man show at the Garrick Theatre outside my back door, as I called it, when I was at the National Gallery, and I went twice to see the show, and he was very moving. It was very moving, you know. He was a real clown that could take you to that point. He could make a joke last 20 minutes. Fantastic. And that take you to that point where you didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And he was an artist on the stage. The way he moved, everything about him was extraordinary. And so I wrote to him on very impressive National Gallery writing paper saying, if you ever have time, I would love you to pose for me or something. I'd love to paint you. And I got this sweet little letter back saying, it's very complimentary, you want to paint little me, what colour? So I ended at the National Gallery at Easter 81, and he came to pose through that Easter, and we became friends, and I painted him a lot, and then they were shown in, I think, 83. Most miserable person I've ever met. Next.
Yes, tell us, this is the first Wall of Water, as far as I can see it from here.
Well, this is a big painting, over 7 feet, over 6 feet by over 7 feet, and it's one of the 8 large paintings that were in room 1 at the National Gallery.
Apart from the smaller 9th one. Yes, do go on.
You're getting it. Anyway, yes, so I was completely into this Wall of Water series, and then this thing came up for Snap, Benjamin Britten, and this is Wall of Water War, and I was making this painting before I began the more direct, if you like, paintings of the victims and the battlefields to make the installation.
And it's interesting that there is a kind of echo between the Walls of Water and the battlefield pictures, because there's something like an explosion in the Tower of Water, and you see that recur, something similar in the technique about the splashes and the sweeping strokes of the paint and so on. Did you feel that one grew out of the other?
You know, it's all done by hand, you know. And I keep my hand in. I'm a manual worker, you know, and I suppose if people ask me about style, I don't know about that. I don't think I have a style, but I suppose I obviously have a way of painting, whether it's a portrait or a battlefield or a victim or a wave painting or whatever it is.
You've said that the idea of painting suggests that it's something that is happening in front of you, and part of the point of painting is that you experience the making of it, in effect, when you look at it. Do you think of that as the advantage that painting has over, say, photography or images on screens? That the human hand is in it, and you share the moment of making?
Yes, I think in the best painting it does. I mean, you stand in front of a Van Gogh or a Rothko or a late Titian or a Rembrandt, and it is as if the painting is happening in front of you. It's because of the great life of oil paint itself in the right hands. You know, and that's something that a photograph could never do, because a photograph is inevitably history. I mean, you know, the photograph has been taken, and it has usually no kind of physicality, because it's flat, and it's behind glass, and it's sort of polite in some way. Paint... Paint.
Back a bit.
Paint. Is that all right?
You can hear it, can't you, John? Yeah, good.
Is it all right, John? Okay. If it's all right with John, it's all right with everyone else. No, I think painting is much more difficult to look at. And I mean, the way to look at a painting is to try to empty yourself so the painting can speak to you. But I mean, the physicality of paint and the fact it's made by a human being, I think it's got all those possibilities going for it, which a photograph is history, you know, inevitably. It's been done. So, I mean, however moving photographs can be, and there certainly are some very moving photographs, that thing of the sort of interaction between you and this physical stuff of paint, it just couldn't happen with a photograph.
Rembrandt is your favourite, I believe. You said that that's because he paints reality, he paints what is. Is that what you are trying to do? Even when you're doing an expressionist painting, you're painting...
I don't do expressionist paintings.
Sorry. How would you define the emotion that is expressed in a painting? They're always representational? They're always...
I certainly don't think that I do abstract paintings. I mean, people called those sea paintings sort of abstract sea paintings. It was ridiculous because they were waves, so how could they possibly be abstract?
Indeed.
You know?
It's like Monet's Nymphaea trying to capture the moment in the water, wasn't it?
Yeah, the action, the movement, yes. Yes, that's what it's about. And
So do you think of all your work as representational?
Yeah.
Should we look at another? This is the Dovecote in Snape. Tell us about and it was hung, in fact, I believe, in a kind of almost parody of those Royal Academy picture hangings with lots of pictures on the wall.
Yeah,
what was the thinking behind that?
Well, I mean, that's obviously the outside of the building. It's a building that was burnt down in the Great Fire at Snape Maltings. So they're the remnants of the brick wall, and then whoever it was made this rather wonderful metal building, which is actually sort of taller than it looks on that slide, sort of rising out of the ruins of the bricks, and it was perfectly suited to the war requiem. And there I am fiddling about with the sound things inside the Dovecote.
And let's move on. Next one. Yes, now this is from the War Requiem series, and one of the faces.
It's a detail of Victim 1, I think.
And there's a whole series of these broken up faces, slightly sort of Lucian Freud.
What? Mention that name.
Didn't you paint him?
Next, please, John. Next. Right.
Did you paint Freud at some point? Tell us about your... Wasn't he a subject of yours?
I have to love the subject I paint.
Right.
I turned down Mrs. Thatcher.
Oh, right.
So the previous image on the screen was a detail of the victim painting on the left.
Yes.
These are two of the victim paintings from the First War Requiem, yeah.
Perhaps, was it Francis Bacon, perhaps?
Bacon's a good boy.
Yes.
Yep. Nothing wrong with him.
Yes, and also, sorry, misremembered, who...
there is a difference.
There is a significant difference. But was there some influence, do you think, of Bacon in these?
Possibly. I mean,
or is it... But I'm allowed to think that, because you can think whatever you see in it.
Yes.
Something that I see in it.
Yes. He could get the paint on the move like Rembrandt, and yes. I do try to get the paint on the move to do with this life thing.
Yes, wonderful. And more victims? And
no,
a battlefield.
That's a battlefield.
Yes, tell us about how the Battlefield series came about. That yellow, by the way, you use a lot, that Indian yellow, which was both a kind of fire and a kind of fanfare on some of these. Sometimes it seems rather joyous, and sometimes it seems very sinister.
Well, that was an idea of the writer of the book.
Yes.
He liked that
James
phrase.
Carhill.
James Carhill, who wrote the book. He's a very bright young man. You'll find everything in that book. Homer, everything. Anyway, he liked this phrase, fire or fanfare or fire or something. I'd never thought of fanfare, I'd only thought of fire, but I mean,
yes.
These authors, they put what they want, I only did the pictures.
Do you think, by the way, do you like considering what yourself, talking about your pictures and considering what they're about, or do you think, well, the picture speaks for itself, I'll leave that to other people?
Well, the thing is, I'm sort of, some inner voice or something made me start painting the victims. Some inner voice started making me paint the battlefields. They're all from the imagination. I didn't look at any photographs or anything like that. Yes. They're just from inside.
Yes.
Does that answer your question? No?
Yes.
Good.
That'll do.
Next, John. That's another battlefield.
I suppose perhaps you didn't answer the question in general. The bigger question of, do you think artists should be able to explain away their pictures? Does it feel like a completely separate and irrelevant activity?
It is completely separate. It's, Matisse said all artists should have their tongues cut out for the amount of rot they talked about their works. Shall I stop now?
No, we like you talking about it. Yes, do you go on?
Next, John.
Yes.
Yes, these are two of the more recent victims, which are part of the installation War Requiem 2 at King's College, and open from 12 to 6 every day, but Mondays until the end of next week.
I can get into the sound installation.
You can.
If I keep trying.
And they feature a lot of this Indian yellow, yeah.
Yes.
Which is a particularly, I was going to say fiery colour. It is a very intense yellow, which was originally made out of camel's urine, and I don't think it's made out of that anymore. It's all chemicals now. But it's this very unreal, very, very bright yellow that I discovered when I was painting a lot of sunrises in the 80s. But it's a colour you can use to say very different things.
You particularly enjoy oils, clearly, with the sort of tactile quality and the way you can paint them thick and manipulate them in that way. But some of your work in the National Gallery, for instance, in the cafe, they also had a series of monotypes, which were black and white. So do you have favourite media? Do you like to do lots of different things? What's your... are there things you wouldn't touch? Do you not want to
I've never sort of understood pastels, because I don't quite understand if you're drawing with them or if you're painting with them, and I don't think I've really tried them very much. I played around a bit and I couldn't get on with them. But the monotypes are as physical as as the oil paints.
Yes.
And it's whatever I'm doing at the time. If I'm making a drawing, that's what I'm doing, or making a piece of sculpture. It's whatever I'm doing at the time. No favourites of anything.
And the Aftermath objects were a different technique altogether, because they were cast-found objects, weren't they? Are they the next ones? Yeah.
No, there's a new battlefield.
Oh, another battlefield.
Yes, that's one of the more recent battlefields.
They suggest both world wars and current conflicts. But did you want to make them universal? Did you want to make them about any particular war?
No, not any particular war, just war. Which is obviously inside all of us.
Yes.
I was interviewed by Mark Mardell, who does The World this weekend, Sunday lunchtime, Radio 4, and in my show at King's College, and he asked me this question in one of the rooms. He said, "Is war always wrong?" And it completely floored me, and I finally, after a very long time, said, I can't answer that question.
Because it's not about making a moral judgment about war, it's about representing it?
No, what would you say? Is war always wrong? I'll ask you the question. What would you say?
Well, actually, I think it is. But I once had to debate the argument against a field marshal that the act of war is indefensible. And I think I made a very good speech, which I still believe. So I would come down on that side. But it's also one of the reasons why I think there is in your picture something that suggests anti-war. Or at least that's what I find in them.
Good.
Good.
I'm not for it, but I mean... I love that line in The Importance of Being Earnest, a line of Lady Bracknell's. The general was essentially a man of peace, except, of course, in his domestic life. Next!
Oh, this was one of the inspirations, was it, for one of the carvings that inspired your work? Can't see
Well,
that.
this very strange medieval carving is not actually by me. It's in Hadley Church, where I grew up in Suffolk. It's a very strange end of a bench, and it's a wolf defending the head of St. Edmund. Strange. I mean, the wolf has a human face, and it's not quite sure whether the head of St. Edmund's is coming out of the wolf's mouth. And as a child, I was always very intrigued by the mystery of this object. It's very strange, and it's all carved out of one piece of wood. And I mean, a lot of... Well, it all goes in, really, when one is a child, because, I mean, about the sea, I can clearly remember when my mother took me to the sea, and I was, 4 or 5 or something, and I'd walk into the sea. It was always Frinton, because my mother was a snob, and I wanted to go to Clacton with the fun fairs, but no, it was always Frinton, very polite. And I remember walking into the sea and talking to it. Talk. I don't know what I said to it, and I don't know if it listened, but I do remember talking to the sea as if it was a friend. And then I'm in Scallop on Aldeburgh Beach. I think really the beginning of that was seeing the fireworks for the coronation when I was 7. Above the sea at Aldeburgh, the nights, all these rockets, explosions into the sky above the sea. I mean, it was incredible. And I think that's possibly was where Scallop began. And I think this carving in Hadley Church, now I think about it, is probably a big part of this series of Aftermath sculpture that I've been doing. And I do remember from Hadley Church 3 colours very distinctly in the stained glass windows, which were alizarin crimson and French ultramarine blue and that mad Indian yellow. So, I mean, these things go in very early.
So is a memory often the trigger of a work of art?
Well, you don't realise till afterwards. I mean, I didn't realise that about Scallop until I'd made it. Mm-hmm. You don't think of those things till afterwards.
So can we see some of the heads or objects that this gave rise to? Explain how these were made. They were found pieces of driftwood?
Not
cast?
driftwood.
No? What were they?
Found pieces of wood. Logs. Pieces of wood found in woods. I mean, several of the pieces of wood I'd had for several years before knowing what might happen with them,
And you modified them slightly before you cast them?
Certainly. I mean, you can add to bits of dead wood. You can saw bits off. You can, like with clay, you can make the object. And then I cover it in a very thin layer of plaster to keep it strong enough to be cast in bronze. These original ones go to the foundry and come back in bronze, and then I paint them. Next, John. Yes, that's called Chatterer.
One of the things that's interesting is that you have names for each of these objects that are suggested by the shape. I found myself playing a game as I went round, trying to work out what the title would be before I actually looked at it. I was quite pleased when I thought that's an elephant and that's a pig.
Oh.
They were for sick pig, I think. And,
good, you're not blind then, that's good. Yes.
But which came first, I wondered? Did you make the thing into the shape of the kind of object that you thought it was?
A piece of wood would suggest to me a pig or a baby elephant, whatever it was. And the author of the book, James Carhill, actually gave them titles. He did want to call this one Pub Boar, and I drew the line at that. And so that is my title, Chatterer, okay? Of course, there are a lot of people in pubs like that who never stop talking, we know, but I thought Pub Boar was really too much. Anyway, so this is called Chatterer, but I mean, these titles are only suggestions. I mean, it's like what people want to choose or find in paintings. It's up to them what they see in them. Next, John. That's called Survivor. Yes.
And again, these are ones where that's what the shape suggested to you, or not necessarily. You don't mind if it's read as something different.
Well, it's very clearly a head.
Yeah,
and I remember exactly finding that piece of wood because my friend Tori Lawrence had a show at Flatford, and all that Constable Country thingy. And we were walking the dogs across the field, and there was a hollow willow tree, and I saw this shape a bit higher up than me, which is quite easy always, of course, and I got a stick and whacked and whacked and whacked until this shape fell into my hands, and I thought, Lord, if they're National Trust cameras, here I am, beating up a constable tree, it'd be big trouble. Anyway, so it was very, very, very fragile, this dead, splintering wood. But I held it together with a plaster, and I did make the hole for the eye. Yes. And then I paint them. Some people think it's very decadent to paint bronze, but I like painting the bronze. Yes. There have been plenty of painted bronzes in the course of art history. Indeed. Next, John.
Is this Mother?
Yeah, that's my mother.
Tell me why. Does it just?
You can see why she went to Frinton. Right colour.
And is it just that it resembles her face, or tell us what makes you call it Mother?
Well, I did think of, obviously I did draw my mother quite a lot. Mm-hmm. She was a frightful nuisance until she was lying in her coffin, because she would. I would start to draw her. My father took no notice. I'd be home for the weekend drawing him in the sketchbook. He'd just carry on with whatever he was doing, take no notice. Fine. But my mother would start arranging her hair. Then she'd take her specs off. Then she'd say, "Have you finished?" After about 5 minutes. But it was when she was lying in that coffin, I thought, I got you now, Mother. You're not going anywhere. Anyway, my relationship with my mother, I suppose, was quite complex. And I had written a poem in the 60s called My Royal Blue Mother. And I found myself making this sort of portrait of Mother with this old wood. And so that's why it's blue.
And did it feel like a restless piece of wood adjusting its hair?
Well, I don't know. Do you think it's a restless piece of sculpture?
Well, possibly.
Because, like this, you only see one angle of sculpture. Sculpture is so difficult to photograph. Obviously, drawing, painting, simple. But a piece of sculpture which has different things going on in it as you move around it is very difficult to photograph. So there are many angles of my mother. Next. Yeah, and there's the Indian yellow again. That is Victim 2.
Yes. Again, distorted face shapes, and so on, which you found often in those. Next.
Oh, baby elephant. Sweet.
But of course...
That was, assembled several pieces of the dead wood.
And the elephant idea occurred to you after the assembly, or as you were putting the three together?
No, I realised it was an elephant as I was making it.
Mm-hmm.
One or two people have said, is it a fox, is it a bull, but you've got to put up with that sort of thing.
Next.
Oh, the last one, I think,
yes.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, tell me about this one. This is your...
Well, it's a portrait of Amy Winehouse.
Yes.
She is still singing, you see, is quite clearly on the left. Her mouth open, and it's as if the voice is still coming through space at one, I hope, and I think it's very much her colours. And from the side, it has to do with how she moved.
And the black and pink, of course, were also the colours of the painting. Both of those appear in the original painting.
Well, I did the painting first, yes, and then this. And it was the painting was reproduced a few times in the papers, and Amy Winehouse's mother got in touch. Mm-hmm. And I met her mother and her present husband at the National Gallery, and they stood in front of this painting for quite a long while in silence, and I was getting quite nervous, because they were not exact people who were incredibly sort of up with contemporary art, if you see what I mean. Anyway, they stood there for quite a long while, and then they sort of... anyway, she stood there and said, "My God, you've got her spirit. I can hear her singing, and that's the way she moved." And whew,
How lovely. How lovely.
it was great when she reacted like that.
I've been very remiss about leaving enough time for questions. I just want to ask you one quick last question. Has your celebrity ever been to your advantage?
Well, yes, actually quite recently. I was in the sculpture studio fiddling about with a bit of wood, and the telephone went, and I made the great mistake of answering it. And it's one of those old, heavy Bakelite telephones, so it was very difficult to... Anyway, it was a young man from BT. And he said, would I like the free offer of this thing, this gadget, this machine, this box, that was going to sort out the broadband, it was going to do the iPlayer, it was going to make you a cup of tea. I mean, there's absolutely no end to what this thing was going to do, and it wasn't going to cost me a penny. And okay, so I had sort of lost, I'm not the slightest bit technical like that, so I sort of lost what he was talking about halfway through, and getting very bored and wanting to get on with the sculpture. And so I said, yes, all right, yes. Then it arrived, very large, and this bill, which he'd said wasn't going to happen. So it sort of hung around in its bag for quite a long while. And I knew I didn't want it. I was never going to be able to work it. And it got to the 14 days you had to ring up to say you didn't want it. So I rang BT. I'm sure some of you here have had that lovely experience. You reached the Commonwealth quite quickly. Anyway, after a bit of Commonwealth, I was put through to, I was put through, and I said hello. I was quite cross by this time. And this voice came on and said, "Hello, my name is Frank, I'm in Belfast." So I said, "Oh," quite crossly. He said, "Well, what can I do for you today? Here I am in Belfast. The name is Frank, by the way." And I was getting, this rather superior voice. I said, "Yes, I have registered your name is Frank," quite crossly at this stage. And so he said, "Well, what can I be helping you with today?" And so he said, "First of all, what's your name? What's your name?" So I said, M. Hambling again. He said, "Oh," he said, "I'm not talking to the world-famous artist Maggi Hambling, am I?" And then, so I said, "Well, I am an artist," I said, by now totally humbled. And he said, "You're still painting the waves. I like your waves very much. You just showed them at the National Gallery, didn't you? I like those waves. You're still busy with the waves." And then he said, "I used to watch you on the television with George Melly." He said, "Oh, we enjoyed that. We enjoyed that a lot. And what are you up to now? What are you working on now? I'd like to know." Anyway, this went on. And then he said, "Did you see the programme on David Hockney the other night? What do you think?" He said, "What do you think of it?" So I said, "Well, I enjoyed it. It was very David. I know David a bit now." He said, no, he didn't like it. Not enough about the work. Too much personality. No, I didn't care for it. Are you doing any more television yourself? Eventually, I am able to explain to Frank that this terrible box has arrived, you see. And he said, "Oh," he said, "he shouldn't have done that. You want to be busy working. Shouldn't be disturbing shouldn't be disturbing a great artist at work." He said, "I'll have a word with him." He said, I said, "Well, what, Frank, what do I do with this?" He said, "I'll send you a bag. He said, "You put that thing in that bag, then you take it to the post office, you won't have to pay, it'll go straight back, get your proof of posting, but, won't cost you a penny." And he said, "I'll scrape that right off your bill." He said, "I'll have a look, see." So I said, oh, Frank, I'm very grateful." He said, "That's all right, they shouldn't be bothering you. No idea who you are." So by this time I'm enormously grateful to Frank in Belfast, and And his parting shot, which is the best of the lot, I said, well, thank you so much for your help, Frank. He said, that's all right, he said, have a fine day. And he said, do you think if I stay at work a bit longer, Mr. Huckney will be telephoning me later? It's true. So it was quite useful that Frank in Belfast had heard of me. And I can actually say that's the only time it's been the slightest bit useful. And any trouble with your telephones, ask for Frank.
And use your name. We're going to run over a bit if you've got questions. I'm going to cheat. Would anybody like to ask any more? Otherwise, I shall ask. Maybe one last one. Oh yes, there's a roving mic here. Any brave people?
Is there another question that we can get the mic to in the meantime?
That one, yes, and line another up, please, if there's another. This gentleman in the front, then.
I think that every Good Friday you make a piece. Why do you do that, and what does it mean to you?
You mean have a go at Jesus?
No, I'm just interested.
Yeah, I do. I do, from terrible childhood memories of Good Friday. You know, no treats, no sweets, no nothing, very grey, going to church. A very black day throughout my childhood. My mother was very churchy. And so it's very difficult for me to think of anything else on Good Friday. So I do. I've made sculptures, I've made drawings, I've made paintings, and I do it each year as a sort of ritual. Obviously, you know, the crucifixion is the moment of life and death together, which is obviously what inspires me. So it seems the natural thing to do, and I have over the years always had a go at Jesus on that. He doesn't pose, but you know, it's all from the imagination.
Is there another question? Otherwise, I might have one last one.
They've all gone to sleep. They don't know.
There's
one.
Sorry, yeah, two. And the gentleman over the back there. Yes.
This could be a two-pronged question over here.
There, and then...
I'm looking at that woman.
Yes.
Hello?
Are there any younger artists you admire these days? And are there any gallerists you admire their eye or the type of artists they're working with?
I'm never sure about that word, gallerist. But, I mean, Sarah Lucas is a close friend of mine. She lives in Suffolk now, and we're great friends, and we have the same birthday. A few years in between, but the same date. And I always liked her the best of the YBA lot. And I have one or two people that I've taught. I mean, have you come across Cecily Brown? Yeah, she was my student for quite a while, because she couldn't get into any art school in London. And so, all kinds of things. I mean, when I was asked... We got a distraction. Nicolette, we got opposition. Must be a dog or a child.
Are we all right? We're all right.
I mean, when I was asked who was my favourite painter, you know, in interviews and things, I always used to say Cy Twombly. I love the work of Cy Twombly. And it's a pity he's died, because I can no longer say Cy Twombly. But I mean, I do like the painting of living painters, Cy Twombly, and Frank Arbach. And I get moved by various things. I mean, the Kiefer show at the Royal Academy, I thought was absolutely fantastic and stunning, marvellous show. So, you know, I respond to lots of things. I try to keep an open thing and go in silence and whatever happens.
Can I ask you, your relationship between paintings, drawings, and sculpture, how do you decide to do one rather than the other? Is it subject bound, or
It's a mouse.
your mood?
It's a mouse.
Sorry.
I'm still with you.
No,
There is a
we're
mouse
listening.
in the house, but I'm still listening.
Yes. Sorry, painting, sculpture. and
Okay,
drawing.
it's a very good question, actually.
Yes.
In the 90s, when everything was so full of gloom and doom, I made a series of laugh paintings, right? Because there was only one thing to do, was to laugh. I mean, everything was so awful. And anyway, I don't see how people get through life without laughing, frankly. There are people who don't laugh. I've noticed. I don't spend much time with them. Anyway, I was making this series of laugh paintings, and they becoming more and more like an object in space, you know. And the painting, there's the canvas, and just a sort of an object like that with just black around it or something. And so that's how I realised that I wanted to make some sculpture, because I thought, what am I doing painting these objects floating around in space? And I'd try and make the objects. So that, you know, the paintings that I was doing at the time made me start making sculpture. And then when drawing, I would say drawing is the sort of at the basis of everything. I mean, as a child, I didn't paint, I drew. And drawing is the basis of everything, and I think incredibly important. And so if I'm making a portrait of someone, I always start with a drawing, you know, and then if I get a bit stuck with the painting, I can do more drawing before going on with the painting. So I do it all different things. I mean, and they sort of grow out of each other or demand to be done at a certain time. Does that make sense?
My last question, Maggie, grows out of something that Diana said in her introduction, that you are a controversial painter. You're no stranger to controversy as an artist. The question is, do these controversies take you by surprise, or do you court them? Do you say or do things?
I mean, when I made Scallop on Aldeburgh Beach, there it was, and I really thought it was one of the this word came up earlier, dicey word, one of the more beautiful things I managed to make, you know. I really thought it was quite beautiful. And it was made, you know, with the pegs in Aldeburgh, and it was, you know, the first sculpture they'd made. It was a huge adventure for all of us, and I thought in their craftsmanship was superb, and so I thought it was rather beautiful, and so that the voices of dissent were quite a shock. And then I think in the is this table wood?
Yes.
Well, it could be wood, I think. I think there've been sort of 13 lots of graffiti scrawled across it. I mean, such boring, you know. Happy Christmas, tin can, move it. Happy Easter, tin can, move it. Happy New Year, tin can, move it. I mean, it's not poetry, you know. And I was always having to think up lines for these Anglian Daily Times, you know, some reaction to the yet another lot of graffiti on the Scallop. And in the end, I said, well, if I'd wanted it to have graffiti, I would have done it myself in the first place. And, you know, and it's not poetry, it's just, abuse, I suppose. But so I was sort of surprised by that.
Yes. And in fact, of course, it also has its fans, as does the Oscar Wilde, Conversation with Oscar Wilde, which is one of your most famous sculptures. But that had its detractors too. When you did it, did you think this is going to be something that will surprise people, will disturb them?
I don't think like that. I mean, I spent about 2 years. I mean, for about 9 months, I'd made the first head and hand of Oscar Wilde in wax, before it was cast in bronze, and it's, you know, big thing to make in wax. And I had a dream that it was all wrong, and I smashed it to pieces and started again. I mean, those are the sort of voices I listen to, not other voices.
Well, I'm very delighted to be able to listen to your voice for the last hour or so, and to the audience for their great attention and their questions. And thank you so much. It's been so interesting to hear and to see your work. Thank you.